The world tells sensitive people that their depth is a weakness. But what if the truth is the complete opposite? What if the most gentle souls carry a power so extraordinary that narcissists secretly fear the day it awakens? Carl Jung hinted at this possibility through decades of observing the human psyche. He noticed that empaths, often the quiet absorbers of pain, can undergo a dramatic transformation when pushed too far. This moment, according to Jung's ideas, is not a breakdown but a breakthrough. It is the instant when years of emotional pressure crystallize into clarity, strength, and psychological independence. In this video, we explore that transformation. We uncover why awakened empaths shift from vulnerable to unshakable. We reveal why narcissists lose their grip the moment an empath sees the pattern. And we show how Jung's concepts of the shadow, individuation, and the transcendent function explain this inner evolution. If you've ever felt drained by others, overwhelmed by emotional chaos, or blamed for problems that were never yours, this message is for you. Because what emerges from the empath's breaking point is not anger, it is sovereignty. It is psychological immunity. It is the rebirth of a healer who finally understands their own worth. Stay with me as we begin this journey into the core of Jungian psychology and the hidden strength of the empathic mind. By the end, you'll see why your sensitivity was never a flaw. It was your superpower waiting to awaken. There comes a moment when the empath suddenly sees the truth. It usually arrives quietly, without warning, like a shift in inner weather. For years they've absorbed blame, soothed others' moods, and convinced themselves that sacrifice equals love. But then something inside snaps into place. This is what Jung described as the lifting of unconscious patterns into awareness. The empath begins to notice the emotional transactions they once overlooked. They see how often they apologized for things they never caused. They recognize the subtle ways others relied on their compassion to avoid responsibility. They start observing the emotional weight they constantly carried on behalf of those around them. This recognition feels shocking at first. It is as if a curtain is pulled back, revealing dynamics that were always there but never understood. Jung believed that this moment of awareness marks the beginning of real psychological freedom. The empath realizes that their exhaustion wasn't random. It was the result of years of absorbing what others couldn't process themselves. They begin to understand how they became the emotional container for friends, partners, or family members. They notice the patterns that repeated across relationships, the same roles, the same expectations, the same unspoken pressure to carry the emotional burden. This awakening is not dramatic on the outside, but inside it feels like a seismic shift. The empath's self-perception begins to change. They realize they were never weak. They were overloaded. They were never oversensitive. They were overextended. They were never too emotional. They were too unprotected. This clarity is the empath's first step toward reclaiming their power. It is the moment they stop believing the narrative that sensitivity equals fragility. Instead, they begin to see it as a form of intuitive intelligence. Jung would call this the start of individuation, the path toward becoming fully conscious of oneself. And once the veil lifts, the empath can never return to unconscious participation in their own depletion. They are now awake. Once the empath recognizes the pattern, an inner shift begins. This shift is what Jung referred to as shadow integration. The shadow contains all the emotions the empath learned to suppress. It holds the anger they were told was inappropriate. It holds the boundaries they were taught were selfish. It holds the sense of self they buried to keep the peace. For years, the empath avoided these parts of themselves. They believed that being good meant being endlessly accommodating. But Jung argued that wholeness requires embracing the parts of ourselves we've disowned. So the empath begins exploring these hidden qualities. They allow themselves to feel anger without guilt. They practice saying no without lengthy explanations. They experiment with choosing self-care over people-pleasing. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The old programming resists the change. But as they continue, something remarkable happens. Their sensitivity becomes clearer, sharper, and less overwhelming. They start to distinguish between their emotions and the emotions of others. They no longer absorb every feeling around them automatically. Jung would call this the development of psychological boundaries. The empath realizes that empathy doesn't mean carrying the world on their shoulders. It means understanding others without sacrificing themselves. Their anger transforms into righteous clarity. Their guilt dissolves into self-respect. Their suppressed power begins to surface as confidence. This process strengthens their intuition. They become more attuned to manipulation. They start recognizing emotional red flags instantly. They sense insincerity before a word is spoken. They see through gaslighting with ease. They no longer confuse empathy with self-abandonment. This new inner balance creates what Jung described as a unified self. The empath becomes both gentle and grounded, compassionate and discerning, open-hearted yet protected. Their shadow no longer controls them from the unconscious. Instead, it becomes a source of strength they can access intentionally. This integration is the foundation of their transformation, because once the shadow is acknowledged, it cannot be used against them. And this is the moment narcissists can no longer predict their reactions. The empath becomes unreadable to manipulators. They are no longer an emotional sponge. They are now a conscious, centered, sovereign being. Their transformation has begun. With the shadow integrated, the empath steps into a new stage of evolution. This is the emergence of what Jung called psychological sovereignty. It is the point where the empath no longer looks to others for approval. They stop measuring their worth through external validation. They begin trusting their inner voice more than the opinions around them. This shift is subtle but powerful. The empath starts making decisions based on alignment rather than obligation. They stop explaining themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer allow guilt to dictate their choices. Their energy becomes more focused and intentional. Jung would describe this as individuation, the process of becoming one's truest self. The empath's identity is no longer built around pleasing others. They no longer define themselves by how much they can endure. Instead, they define themselves by what they consciously choose to allow. This sovereignty changes their relationships dramatically. Manipulators feel the shift instantly. Narcissists sense that the empath is no longer emotionally accessible. The old buttons no longer work. The familiar guilt tactics lose power. The empath's silence becomes stronger than their former explanations. Their neutrality becomes more powerful than their former emotional responses. They no longer react impulsively to provocation. They observe, they evaluate, they choose their response with clarity. This makes manipulators deeply uncomfortable. Narcissists depend on predictable emotional reactions, but a sovereign empath cannot be controlled, intimidated, or provoked. Their presence becomes grounded and calm. Their energy becomes steady and self-contained. This calmness acts like a psychological mirror. It reflects the narcissist's unresolved inner chaos back at them. Without the empath absorbing their projections, the manipulator must face their own emotional reality, and this is something they are profoundly unequipped to handle. Meanwhile, the empath feels stronger than ever. They begin forming relationships based on mutual respect. They seek out people who communicate clearly and love authentically. They stop being drawn to emotional chaos. They stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. They stop confusing suffering for loyalty. Their heart remains open, but their boundaries stand firm. They realize that being loving does not require being self-sacrificing, and they discover that true strength is the ability to remain soft without being taken advantage of. This is empathic sovereignty in action. As the empath steps into sovereignty, their perception sharpens dramatically. This is the phase where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes visible. Opposites within the empath harmonize to create a new level of awareness. Their emotional sensitivity merges with grounded clarity. Their intuition becomes more precise. Their inner boundaries become more defined. This evolution turns the empath into what I call an empathic seer. They no longer just feel emotions. They interpret them. They no longer just sense energy shifts. They understand what those shifts mean. They begin noticing micro-expressions, subtle inconsistencies, and hidden motives. They detect manipulation before it unfolds. They feel the narcissist's insecurity beneath the charm. They sense the fear behind the anger. They see the fragility behind the arrogance. This ability makes them nearly impossible to deceive. Manipulators depend on emotional fog, but the awakened empath sees clearly through the haze. They no longer internalize accusations. They no longer absorb projections. They no longer doubt their own perception. Instead, they trust it more than ever. This clarity disrupts dysfunctional dynamics instantly. When an empath sees the truth, the manipulator loses control. Their tactics become obvious. Their emotional hooks no longer land. Their attempts to create guilt fall flat. Their false narratives collapse under the empath's steady gaze. Jung believed that consciousness itself is the greatest threat to unconscious manipulation. the empath becomes a walking spotlight. Their mere awareness exposes the shadows around them. This is why narcissists often react desperately when empaths awaken. They intensify their manipulation. They shift strategies. They attempt to regain control, but none of it works anymore. Because the empath isn't fighting back, they are simply seeing clearly, and clarity cannot be manipulated. This new perception empowers the empath in every situation. At work, they set boundaries without fear. In family systems, they refuse emotional blackmail. In relationships, they no longer tolerate gaslighting or inconsistency. They stop second-guessing themselves. They stop giving endless benefit of the doubt. They stop ignoring their intuition to maintain harmony. They act from truth rather than fear. This is the empathic seer, awake, aware, and impossible to control. At this stage, the empath completes the transformation Jung hinted at throughout his work. They shift from the wounded healer archetype to the sovereign healer. The wounded healer absorbs pain unconsciously. The sovereign healer transforms pain consciously. This difference is profound. It turns the empath from a passive vessel into an active creator of their own emotional reality. They no longer give from depletion. They give from fullness. They no longer help to feel worthy. They help because they choose to. They no longer sacrifice themselves to maintain relationships. They choose relationships where sacrifice is unnecessary. This transformation changes how they engage with the world. Empaths once drawn to broken people now seek out conscious, stable partners and friends. They stop trying to rescue others. They stop trying to fix what isn't theirs. They stop letting guilt dictate their choices. Their empathy becomes intentional instead of automatic. Their compassion becomes discerning instead of blind. Their boundaries become consistent instead of negotiable. This makes them safe for genuine connection and dangerous for manipulation. Jung believed that true healing begins when we accept every part of ourselves. The sovereign empath embodies this acceptance fully. They embrace their sensitivity as a gift. They honor their intuition as wisdom. They treat their emotional energy as sacred. They protect their peace as a priority rather than an afterthought. As they do this, their presence begins to influence others. They inspire people to face their own patterns. They encourage others to confront their own shadows. They model emotional maturity simply by existing authentically. This is what Jung called contributing to the evolution of the collective psyche. Empaths who awaken create ripple effects around them. They elevate conversations. They strengthen relationships. They make unconscious behavior visible. They bring clarity to emotional chaos. They become leaders without trying to be. Their power is quiet but unmistakable. They create environments where honesty thrives. They foster connections rooted in equality and respect. They become examples of what healthy empathy looks like. And for the first time, their empathy no longer hurts them. It fuels them. It guides them. It protects them. It empowers them. This is the sovereign healer. Whole, aware, powerful, and deeply compassionate. A force of light that cannot be manipulated, deceived, or diminished. Thank you for joining this journey into the empath's transformation. We explored how recognition, shadow work, sovereignty, clarity, and healing shape the evolution of the empathic soul. If this message resonated with you, remember that your sensitivity is not a weakness but a highly refined form of awareness. You now understand the power that awakens when an empath finally says enough. If you want to support more content like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Psychology Insights, and share it with someone who needs this message today. Your awakening matters, and the world needs more sovereign empaths.